My guest today, my special guest, is Reverend McNair Ezzard. Reverend Ezzard is an ordained Methodist minister. He is also a healthcare administrator and a longtime student of the Ageless Wisdom teachings. And it's wonderful to have you here, McNair. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dick.
For starters, would you share a little bit about your background and about how you came to be interested in death and dying?
It's interesting because it seems like to me it's been a lifelong interest. Even when I was a child, I used to read about ghosts and hauntings and things like that. I think that was probably my first indication that I had an interest, and went off to college, and I majored in film and television. I did a couple of films on death and dying. Went to seminary, did my thesis on hospice and death and dying, and got involved in hospice after that. Maybe there's some unresolved issues around the prospect of death that I want to deal with, and this is my way. I don't know, but it's certainly the ultimate question for all of us about what happens when we die and how our lives are shaped based on our fear or not fear of death.
What is your experience of how our society views death?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're a death-denying society.
Death-denying?
Death-denying. We've had a lot of advances over the last 30 years in how we care for the dying through such programs as hospice, where people are enabled to die free of machinery and no pain. But basically, we still deny that death exists. We can see it in the way that we keep people alive in nursing homes, where quantity is much more important than quality.
Quality of life.
And in hospitals, where we keep people attached to machines, where if we would unattach those machines, the people would die and move on. We see it in our advertisements on television, the shows that people watch, which emphasize youth. Very seldom do we see senior citizens advertising products on television. It's all geared to youth and being alive and those sorts of things. We don't really take the time to think about death and what it means for our lives. So yeah, I would say we're definitely a death-denying society.
Do you get the impression that most people think death is a bad thing then?
If you're lying in pain and you've been suffering with cancer for months, even maybe a year or so, then death may not look like such a bad thing.
Right.
But if you're young, 30s, 40s, 20s, 50s, and you feel like you've got your whole life ahead of you, death could be seen as bad. It just depends on the person whether we would view it as good or bad. And every culture is different too. Different religions view death differently. So it's just a matter of the society and the people that make up that society.
So death isn't necessarily viewed as bad then?
Not necessarily.
Do you think it's feared?
I think it's feared. I think there's not only the fear of death, but there's also the fear of dying. You and I talked earlier before the show about we weren't necessarily afraid of death, but we're afraid of the process of dying, that we didn't want to be in pain, that we didn't want to die too young. That kind of issue is totally different than the fear of death itself. With the fear of death, we fear loss of our identity. We fear judgment. Say if we're deeply steeped in the Christian traditional teaching of heaven and hell, we fear judgment and that we're going to go to hell if we didn't live a good life.
Right.
Those sorts of things. Fear loss of our family and friends, loss of our identity. All these things are tied up with a fear of death.
So there's a lot of fear around death.
There can be, yeah. Most of it covered up that we're not even in touch with.
Well, how did we get there? How did we get to the point where society is so preoccupied with the fear of death?
I don't know that they're so preoccupied with it, but we're so focused on this identity as this body or this job or this house or this relationship. We identify with the things of this world, and we think that that's who we are. And this whole idea, and so we don't really even think about death, but when we're confronted with it, we could see very easily that we have a fear of death. When we lose a friend or we see a big calamity happen in the world and it hits home with us, we could come face to face with our fear if we're open to it. But it's really basically through our conditioning. It may be societal conditioning, but more importantly, I think it's through religious conditioning that the church, especially in the West, the Christian church, has not taught us the truth about who we are. You know, we were all familiar with that teaching that we're sinners from the word go, that we're sinners,
Original
worms in the
sin.
dust, you know, and that we have no chance of ever getting out of that.
Right.
That's just the status of things. But we're not. We're much more than that. And according to the ageless wisdom teachings, which I've studied for a number of years, we are really spiritual beings, divine beings, children of God, if you will, that are here for a purpose and are on a long journey. So it's basically the conditioning, the teachings that we've been confronted with from our youth until now, and throughout the last 2,000 years has gotten us into this predicament of not really knowing what happens after death and not knowing who we are.
Growing up in the Christian tradition myself, one of the things that I thought a lot about as a young person was the fear of death, because I hadn't lived as well as I could, as rightly as I could, and I was afraid to go to hell. Is there a hell?
I don't think so. Not
No?
in the traditional way that we have of understanding hell. Hell is not a place under the earth where there's a devil and he stands there and
there's fire.
And there's fire and you spend the rest of your time there after you die. So no, there's not a hell. Hell, you can have hell on earth. There's many people who experience hell right here on earth. And depending on our desires and our state of consciousness, that creates our own life. We each create our own life situation. And the strength of our desires and where those desires are focused can create a hell for us. And when we die and we go to a different level of consciousness or awareness on the other planes of existence, those desires and those things that we used to dwell on and focus on when we were in the body, they don't suddenly disappear, they go with us. So we can take the hell that we might create for ourselves here, we experience it on the other side when we leave the body. So there is a hell, but it's of our own making, and it's of our own state of awareness.
Okay, so somebody who in their lifetime is has low self-esteem and doesn't think much of themselves and is very critical of others and is pretty much a miserable, lonely person, are you saying that when they die, their hell is going to be that they're going to continue in that state of consciousness, that state of mind, that kind of thing?
In a sense, yeah. Until we learn the truth about who we are and until we manifest that truth in our day-to-day existence, till we learn that we're children of God and that we're here for a purpose and that love is what we're supposed to be learning and manifesting in our relationships. We die, but we come back again. So we'll learn the next time if we don't learn this time.
So the concept of rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That eventually we'll get it right and we'll manifest.
Okay, if there's no hell, technically speaking, then what about heaven? Is there no heaven?
Heaven is a state of awareness as well. And actually there's two ways to look at heaven. There's heaven in the sense that it's a state of consciousness. We can experience heaven on earth if we have enough love in our hearts and we manifest enough love in our relationships. We could experience heaven right here in this time, in this body, as a person. If humanity as a whole was manifesting enough love and we experienced a civilization of peace and harmlessness and well-being, we could experience that sort of heaven right here on earth. But heaven is not a place where you go when you die and you knock on the pearly gates, and if you're lucky, St. Peter will turn the key and let you in, and if not, you go to the other place. That's not what heaven is about.